So with that, we're going to jump right in. Like I said, we're really lucky to have 5 panelists here today who will be discussing the co-production of knowledge in the North. Since they know themselves the best, I'm going to let them introduce themselves. We'll start with Dr. Fraser, and then Ms. Behe, then Ms. Kritsch, then Dr. Joly, and then finally Dr. Ljubicic. And if I said your name wrong, I apologize and feel free to correct me. So we will get started. Dr. Fraser, do you want to kick us off with an intro?
Yes, Banguinzi, Joly, Crystal Gale Fraser, Vilji, Shiwan Cut, Juliet Mary Bullock, Shannon, to Inchu, to at Bruce Fraser, Shitie, to Inchu, Gu Yatesi Dichu, to at Marka Andre, Shitsu, to Inchu, to at Richard Bullock, Shitchi, to Inchu, Anuvik, to at Dechancho Genjik, Gwitcha Gwitchin Ithli. Good morning, my name is Crystal Fraser. I'm Gwitcha Gwitchin, originally from Anuvik and Dechancho Genjik, my family's fish camp along the Nagwachonjik, the Mackenzie River in the Northwest Territories. I am currently coming to you from Treaty 6. I'm on the U of A campus in my Tory office, which has no heat. So I'm making a giant cup of tea behind me. I have several space heaters going. I'm an assistant professor cross-appointed between the Department of History and Classics and the Faculty of Native Studies. My pronouns are she, her. I've lived in Edmonton for 17 years when I moved here to start my BA, and I have a partner and a 5-year-old daughter here, and always very excited to rethink about my relationship with Treaty 6 lands, particularly as someone who comes from a family who was involved in Treaty 11 negotiations in our own territory. So my research specifically looks at the North. It looks at my PhD thesis looks specifically at the history of Indian residential schooling in the Gwich'in settlement area. That was a family history for me, and I wrapped that up in 2019. I'm currently interested in histories of midwifery, of women's medicine and healthcare, of child rearing. So once it is safe to travel again back home, that is definitely where the direction of my research is going. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. I'm going to pass it off to Carolina Behe.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. Yep, I'm Carolina Behe. I'm the Indigenous Knowledge and Science Advisor for the Inuit Circumpolar Council. I work out of Alaska, but across the Inuit homelands. The Inuit Circumpolar Council was founded in 1977 by Eben Hobson Sr. with the idea of bringing Inuit together to address common concerns through a common voice. And so today we advocate on behalf of about 185,000 Inuit across Chukotka, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. And most of our work is done internationally, but we do have an office in each one of those countries. And so for my office, it's very important that we're always guided and informed by Indigenous knowledge and directly from the communities. So we're quite fortunate to do a lot of work directly with communities. For myself, a lot of that work has been part of a team focused on food security and food sovereignty, biodiversity, climate change. It kind of encompasses everything, to be honest with you, because food security describes everything. And then so does Indigenous knowledge. But then we need to carry all of those messages to an international area as well. And so just not out of intention, co-production of knowledge is innately part of every single thing we do, because Indigenous knowledge needs to be there, whether we're having a discussion at a community level, a regional level, or a global level. And the challenges that have arisen with that has required us to put a lot of focus on it. Koyana.
Great, thank you, Carolina. And I will pass it to Ingrid Kritsch.
Oh, good morning. And my name is Ingrid Kritsch. And hello from Sherwood Park, Alberta. We moved down here about a year ago and previously lived in the Northwest Territories for about 30 years. I use she, her as pronouns. I'd like to acknowledge that I now live on Treaty 6 territory, and I'm really delighted to be here today as a fellow panelist. I've worked as a cultural anthropologist and archaeologist in the Canadian subarctic for 45 years, carrying out community-based research on subjects ranging from pre-contact and traditional land use and toponymy to the replication of traditional material culture. And these interests come from a desire to build bridges to advance the process of reconciliation in Canada. For much of my career, I've worked with the Gwich'in, who are the most northern First Nation in Canada, and in particular as founding executive director and then research director of the Gwich'in Social and Cultural Institute, created by and now part of the Gwich'in Tribal Council. From 1993 to 2019, when I retired, we had carried out over 120 research projects, resulting in an unparalleled archive of Gwich'in oral history, traditional knowledge, and language materials, one that really cannot be recreated. During my tenure, we also worked in collaboration with researchers and graduate students from universities around the world. In essence, all our research was grounded in the co-production of knowledge and knowledge sharing. I'll just give you one example. A place names project we carried out over 23 years involved more than 74 elders and traditional land users sharing their knowledge with researchers trained in anthropological research methods, and then working with academic and other partners to make their knowledge widely available, in this case in the form of an online place name and story atlas and a series of place name maps. We also worked with government to officially recognize 500 Gwich'in place names, which significantly decolonizes the maps of Northwestern Canada. And I'm really happy to say this project was recognized in November of last year, in 2020, with a Governor General's History Award. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ingrid. Next, we have Dr. Tara Joly.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me and making space for this conversation with such awesome people who I really look up to. So thanks so much. I am Tara Joly. I use she, her pronouns, and I am currently on the unceded territory of the Lheidli First Nation, which is Prince George, British Columbia. And here I'm an assistant professor in anthropology at the University of Northern British Columbia. And my research focus and interests kind of align with environmental anthropology, so different ways of knowing the environment and how those knowledge systems can come together or not. I personally grew up in Ontario, so I identify as a white settler, and my family has roots in France and the UK, but we've been in Canada since about the 1600s. And my work, I've been involved in a lot of community-based research in Northern Alberta, which is Treaty 8 territory, so homeland to Cree, Dene, and Métis people, and it's Métis Nation of Alberta Region 1 territory. And this area is also known as the Athabasca Oil Sands region. So a lot of my work with Indigenous communities, mostly McMurray Métis, has been to support their research goals, which often are in response to cumulative effects of extractive industry. And my research has been from both academic and consulting settings, often combining the two. So I've been involved in environmental monitoring projects, traditional use studies, and documenting cultural history and Indigenous knowledge. Thanks so much for having me.
Wonderful. Thanks, Dr. Joly. And last but not least, we have Dr. Gita Ljubicic.
Thanks so much. Hello, everyone. And yes, you got that pronunciation correct. My name is Gita Ljubicic. I use the pronouns she, her, and I'm joining you today from Hamilton, Ontario, So situated on the traditional territory shared between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Nations, and in lands governed by the Dish with One Spoon wampum belt. And I wanted to touch on that a little bit. That wampum uses the symbolism of a dish to represent the territory, and one spoon to represent that all people share the resources and the land in that territory and take only what they need. So we all have a role to play in fulfilling this early wampum belt agreement, which represented an agreement among nations to share responsibility for caring for the lands and waters around us, and respecting and helping each other to maintain peace in those relations. And so the vision of working together is part of everything that I do. And so sharing responsibility and caring for lands underlies the work I do with Inuit communities. So in Inuit Nunangat, in Inuit homelands across the Canadian Arctic. I'm originally from Ottawa, and it was a life-changing experience for me to spend 2 months on the tundra on Boothia Peninsula during my master's research. And that really shaped the journey that I followed since then in research, and to working with Inuit communities to learn from Inuit knowledge to address Inuit community priorities in research. So I'm dedicated to a cooperative, community-driven approach to research that involves developing and fostering working relationships with Indigenous experts and organizations at all stages of the research process. I've mostly worked in Nunavut, so with Panartummiut in Pangatang, with Amiturmiut in Igloolik, with Sikusilarmiut in Kingite, and with Uksukturmiut in Johaven, Nunavut. And since 2001, been working to learn about sea ice, caribou, plants, and water in relation to climate change, northern lifestyles and livelihoods, and decision-making from local to national scales. So I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And I look forward to learning from all the panelists here.
Wonderful. Thanks, Gita. So that was a really great place to start. It's great to learn more about all of you and hear some of the context behind the work you're doing and where you're coming from, and where you're coming from today in terms of Zoom. That's one good thing about being able to work virtually. So with that, we're going to jump into our first question. I just want to let participants know if any of these questions prompt questions for you, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. If they're quick questions, we might be able to type responses to them. Otherwise, we'll get to them after we do these two structured questions, which will kind of help frame the conversation. So feel free to drop those in the Q&A at any point. So our first question here, and we're going to go in the same order that we went for introductions. So I will let you just transition between each person yourselves, unless you don't know who you're going after, and then I'll give you a cue. And our first question is, what does co-production of knowledge and or knowledge sharing mean to you, and why is it important, especially here in 2021?
Okay, I think I'm up first. Thanks for that important question. And I haven't met all of my co-panelists before today, so it's really lovely to meet you and nice to see you again, Ingrid. Yeah, the co-production of knowledge and knowledge sharing. And I just think back to my great-grandmother who first trained me in oral history. Her name was Joly Andre, and just having her in my life for the first few years that I was a toddler. She would speak to me in our language, Ndinjiju Ginjik, and just being present with her and listening to those stories as a young child. And I mean, I think that we often think that knowledge or the transmission of knowledge needs to come from this top-down approach, in the sense that we recognize the expertise of our elders, which definitely should be the case. But I suppose as I move, as I get older every year, I'm now in my 40s, that I'm realizing that is not necessarily the case, that there is many youth particularly of this generation who, you know, have been intergenerationally affected by colonialism and residential schooling, and in people my age and even slightly younger, we didn't necessarily benefit from learning from our parents about many traditional skills and what it is like to live a Gwich'in life on the land. And you know, people like me and also younger are relearning these skills from our elders, but I'm also learning that youth really have a big part in how we understand knowledge, how we transmit knowledge. I think anyone here who is a parent would agree that, you know, you actually learn a lot from your children about yourself. And so I've just been kind of thinking through the ways in which we share knowledge in communities about if, you know, through the process of colonialism, if you know, some of our cultures have kind of internalized this, you know, hierarchy of age in the way that we look at how we transmit knowledge and share new ideas. And so that's, like, in a snapshot, one of the things that I've been thinking about, particularly when I interview people in my research and who we focus on. And I mean, even in Indigenous communities, there seems to be, you know, like a few really go-to people that you must talk to in order to establish a relationship. But what those relationships could mean when we actually look at the community in a much fuller and more thorough way, and what kinds of perspectives that we might just be accidentally marginalizing by not really rethinking our methodology on an ongoing basis.
Sorry, I put myself on mute. Koyana for sharing that, Crystal, and I haven't met any of the other panelists, so it's wonderful to meet all of you virtually. I'm sure this is quite a question for all of us that we could all spend a lot of time with. So I think co-production of knowledge has become a very, as I said before, become a very central point for us out of necessity and out of history because of marginalization, because of racism, because of violence and aggression, and a lot of both national and international systems that are developed through processes to address the needs and questions of dominant cultures and not in Indigenous peoples. And so that really requires for us to have a lot of focus. But then why is it important? Becomes much larger and very layered. And I think in one way that I might just borrow a story from when we're talking about food security to try to talk about this, because it really comes back to what do we think Indigenous knowledge is? How do we define it? What does it mean to us? And how do we value it? And so one thing, you know, when we are meeting with other scientists and trying to bring together Indigenous knowledge and science, one thing, a story that we try to share, even though this is explaining food security, is an example of walrus. And if a walrus hunter goes out to get walrus, that walrus hunter really needs to think about multiple variables, multiple pieces. They need to consider the movement of sea ice, the thickness of sea ice, the temperatures of the water in the air, the salt in the air, the salts in the water, the currents in the water. They need to think about how that walrus is acting, how it's acting towards other walruses, how it's acting with other animals, the color of the tusk, like if the tusks are yellow, they might have been cannibalizing and won't be right in the mind. Where have they been birthing? They have to think of all of these things. Then when you have this, then when you start to process the walrus, you have to think of the texture of the fat, the color of the fat, the texture and taste of the meat, the smell of it. You have the contents of the stomach for the walrus, because people eat that content. You have to consider all those things. But you also have to consider the young boy that's being taken out every single year to learn his relationship within that environment, to learn his relationship with the walrus. And the first time he gets that walrus and he brings it back and provides it to a provider and becomes a, or provides it to an elder and becomes a provider as opposed to being provided for. I'm going to try to say this really fast. This really sums up that we're asking different questions and we need those different questions. From an Indigenous knowledge perspective, we have this holistic view with multiple variables and we need the questions that are coming from that. Where there's not a separation from the abiotic, biotic, and cultural elements. It's all interconnected. Okay, thank you. Clear.
I guess to me, the co-production of knowledge and knowledge sharing means partners with diverse knowledge bases and ways of knowing, working collaboratively and respectfully towards the production of knowledge within a process that's clearly defined, shared, and meaningful, and benefits all partners. Why is it important? Well, in working with Indigenous people, I think this helps build bridges between our cultures with different knowledge systems and worldviews. And it helps to better inform and understand the world we live in and make it a more respectful and actually a safer place to live. It's an important part of Indigenous nation building, particularly I think when the research is Indigenous led and directed to strengthen, for instance, cultural identity, foster individual and community well-being, protect land and water rights. I can give you an example with our traditional land use, place names, oral history, and archaeology research. We built an inventory of heritage sites within the traditional lands in the Yukon and Northwest Territories. That's now called the Gwich'in Settlement Region because of the land claim that was signed in 1992. And this building this heritage inventory helped us not only go to something that Crystal said about the youth and younger people in the community. It gave us opportunities to build sort of intergenerational opportunities with youth as well as working with elders and researchers, getting them onto the land so that they could learn firsthand, the knowledge about the land from their elders. And it helped us gain insight into past knowledge and use of the land, preserve ancient aspects of the Gwich'in language embedded in the names, ensured that culturally significant heritage sites and places are recognized, protected, and managed in a manner consistent with Gwich'in values. We're able to develop educational resources for schools, universities, museums, interpretive centers, and online for the general public. Ensure that the place names were recognized. Also helped us review land use permits and provide advice on possible impacts on heritage resources, as well as input on other heritage and land management issues. But while the foundation of our research revolved around the study of place names, traditional land use, we also carried out research on knowledge about plants for food and medicine, astronomical knowledge about the sky, the Gwich'in language, ecology, climate change, the replication of material culture items, and a variety of species at risk. I think each of these projects are examples of co-production of knowledge, of elders working with researchers, both within our organization and outside, including a lot of the ologists like anthropologists, biologists, archaeologists, botanists, paleontologists, plus cartographers, geographers, linguists, museum curators, exhibit and web designers, heritage specialists, with each bringing their own knowledge and skills to the subject and producing knowledge and products that can be shared within the communities, Gwich'in communities, but also the rest of the world. And that was always a very important part of working with our elders, with the elders. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's me next. Thanks so much, everyone. I really love these responses so far. For me, co-production, I guess the view from anthropology, like from a more Western science, qualitative science perspective, means following the principles of community-based participatory research and creating space for and supporting Indigenous methodologies. And I see all research kind of like a conversation. So it's all about relationships, and it's about balancing power between the participants of that conversation. Those of us trained in Western science, even social sciences, in this conversation often need to take a bit of a back seat. We can participate and guide the projects and the process, but make space for it to be controlled by communities. In some of the work that I've been involved in with environmental monitoring in Alberta, there's been a lot of conversations about integrating knowledge systems from the government level, which is fantastic. But in practice, there's a lot of challenges with this. The way it plays out isn't necessarily ideal, and Indigenous knowledge systems are often still being forced to fit within settler state funding and governance systems, which often privilege Western science and often natural sciences and more quantitative sciences. So even though it's not the intention of a lot of these programs, Western science is often given more power. And many individuals, even some scientists that I know working in Indigenous communities, still sometimes perpetuate a misunderstanding of the value of Indigenous knowledge. I've heard it be called just local and just stories. So I think that there is some educational work that needs to be done, and some work that needs to be done by Western scientists in particular, to understand where communities are coming from and to recognize the value of their knowledge. And this is an ongoing process, and it's one that I continually am learning within. So on that note, co-production also means being patient. So for Western scientists, not necessarily pushing your own agenda and your own timelines, but really knowing when to listen, and also knowing when to offer your knowledge. So being humble, but also recognizing that you do have something to offer as well. It often means a long-term relationship. And for scientists working on Indigenous land, at the very least, it means communicating with local nations whose territory you're on. Often they're very interested in your work too and would love to hear about it. I've also been involved in a project in which we discussed co-production of knowledge as learning together. And the idea is everyone's kind of in this circle of learning, and everyone is whatever, time's up. Anyway, I just want to end with, it is important for ethics and about relationships generally. Often the work is better when knowledge is co-produced, and it's important to attempt to disrupt colonial legacies of science in the North, and to give communities opportunities to assert sovereignty. Thanks.
Thanks to everyone. I'm happy to go at the end because I fully echo everything that I was just hearing. And it is a big question. I was really trying to think about how would I express this? So to me, it's building off what others have already said. To me, co-production means working together. So simply working together at all stages of a research project. And so I guess I would really like to emphasize that it's not just at the planning phase. It's not just about reporting the results in the end. It's not just about working with community members, hiring in a few specific roles. It's really about working together to make decisions in every step of the way about research design and methodology and ethics and who to work with and how to collect or share or interpret information and with who, when is it appropriate to share with different audiences. So to me, it's really thinking about it as, all aspects of working together. And in that, I think it's important to talk about the roles that we each play. We each bring different strengths to a project. And I think it's important to talk about that early on and to then continually reassess what those roles are and what we can contribute. And I would also emphasize knowledge exchange. So working towards mutual understanding, mutual goals, mutual benefits. And especially on mutual understanding, I've worked a lot on both sea ice topics and caribou. So Inuit knowledge of sea ice and Inuit knowledge of caribou. And language was so important, really understanding the Inuktitut terminology and not just what that translates to in English, but what is the underlying meaning, not the face value translation, but what does it really mean if you communicate the concept that the Inuktitut conveys. I feel like that is such an important aspect of co-production. So I guess the last few points to highlight is that to me, it also involves a long-term commitment. And like many of you have already highlighted, a real focus on relationships and building relationships across generations, across cultures, relations with the land, and all of our responsibilities in that. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I really appreciate everyone answering that question so honestly, and also for bearing with me as I have to cut you off at 3 minutes, which feels like it's not even remotely enough time. So really, really wonderful answers despite my time limits here. So the second question, and again, folks, this is the last structured question, so feel free to submit any questions that you have to the Q&A below. It should be on your bottom bar there for all the attendees, because we're also interested in hearing from you. So our second question is, what do you think is most important that students, especially graduate students, know about the co-production of knowledge in research writing or even project design? And we're going to keep the order the same that we have thus far.
Yeah, these are all super important questions. And I feel like, you know, for anyone who's feeling overwhelmed here, like graduate courses could take a whole semester and talk about these issues versus 3 minutes for each of us. And I just really want to acknowledge what everyone has said. It is definitely my belief and practice that Indigenous communities need to be a part of the process from the very beginning, and from the beginning, I mean, you know, not when you get your funding and you can start your interviews, but from the beginning of the research development process, like what even questions that you're asking and you're interested in. Additionally, and in part, I come from the discipline of Indigenous studies. Indigenous studies scholar Rob Innes makes a very compelling argument that this research also needs to be beneficial and valuable for Indigenous communities. And you know, as we select our interests and as we nurture and develop the interests of our graduate students, I would just really encourage everyone to say, you know, how am I benefiting from this research? And then how is the community also benefiting? And often when we break that down, you know, at the end of the day, an Indigenous community might not see a lot of tangible changes for the better in their community. Whereas we have someone who, you know, the scholar who did the research, who then went and presented on it at international conferences, who had the travel paid for through grants, who then wrote the thesis, who then won the award and got a career. And so I think that we have to do quite a bit of brainstorming around that, particularly you know, in the social sciences, in the humanities. You know, Ingrid, you'll be familiar with this project, but the H. pylori project in Aklavik, in Old Crow, I mean, that project changed people's lives because they were able to improve the health of Indigenous peoples in that community, and it was also led by the people who live there. And so when we think about you know, the advantages of co-production of knowledge, I suppose my advice would be to carefully think about how you're benefiting, how your career is benefiting, and just stay in close contact with the communities. Also know that at some point you're going to screw up. You're going to make a mistake. At that point, you need to be, somebody mentioned being humble, you know, acknowledge what you did. It's going to happen. Even people who are Indigenous, who are from the communities, these things also happen to us. And so thank you. Just go forward with grace. Recognize that, you know, this is a process of often personal change and discomfort and growth. And that process in itself is worthwhile, no matter how hard it is.
Anna, this is so much. We have huge papers written on everything you need to do, and communities are being very loud about what they would want done. So I'll just try to pick up really fast because this 3 minutes does go very fast. I think we have been very focused on equity, that in understanding what equity means and understanding that that could have a cultural lens to it. Understanding that you might be coming from a culture with processes that are supporting you, not supporting the Indigenous communities. And so having to continuously, even as an Indigenous organization, Indigenous person, having to continuously ask, did I do that with complete equity? Is there another way that I could be doing that? And this is everything from, how did we just have that discussion? How was that meeting held? What kind of language was used to have this discussion? So it's really a question that has to be asked everywhere. Very, very much agree with this whole points about humility and relationship building, understanding that Indigenous knowledge has its own approaches, has its own methodologies, and it's crucial that you trust and respect that you're trying to leave at the door what you think you know, and sit there and be listening and actively be listening. And a lot of times at international forums, we often think, you need a chemist for this project. Don't pick the best chemist, pick the person with the highest emotional intelligence that's capable of sitting at the table and hearing other people, because that's what we actually need to move things forward. And then some other points that were touched upon is remembering communities, Indigenous peoples, they have a right to say no. This is Indigenous peoples' homelands. Just because you think it's a great project does not mean that they have to agree to it or that they have time for it. We've had terrible situations where and some researchers believe their research was more important than the hunting activities that was occurring. That is not true. The research is not more important than the food security, no matter what the research is. And so it's just very, very important to be giving focus and understanding who it is that you're working with and giving trust and respect to that. And with that, I would also even say, I really agree that it could be very overwhelming for people that are just coming into it. And for all of us, really embracing that this is messy. It is messy for any of us to bring together Indigenous knowledge and science. And that's okay. It's really okay for us to fail. It's really okay for us to pick it up and figure out what's the better way to do it. Again, we just have to do it with trust and respect and humility. And then the last part that I wanted to just say on that is the relationship building doesn't start or end with you building a project. It's before that. My interest in having a relationship isn't what I'm going to get from you. It's in having that relationship for us to be together, to be thinking through things. I don't quite know how to define that other than just knowing it's not just about the project. Okay, Queen.
There's just so much to say, and I just love listening to you all. Really, there's so much, and I totally agree. You know, you're coming in as a young student researcher, it could just be totally daunting and messy, you know, but it's such an enriching experience overall. And one thing I'd like to speak to just a little bit is, I think, and this has been said, I think Carolina has said it and Crystal said this, I think the qualities of a really fine researcher. I just wrote down some. I think these, first of all, a passion for your research, that I think is critical. An open mind, patience, respectful nature, ability not to take yourself too seriously. As you said, you're going to mess up, and that's all right. You learn from that. Being humble, recognize that you're going to learn throughout your whole life, and genuine interest in people and endurance, I think, are really critical in terms of qualities of really a good researcher. Getting to sort of the nitty-gritty, it's been said before, and I'll say it again, the importance of long-term collaboration, between yourself and the communities, the members, other researchers. It really takes time to build that trust and mutual respect, between partners. And I'd like at this point to really acknowledge that I was so fortunate to meet at very sort of early stages of my career with the Gwich'in, amazing person who ended up being my research partner for 30 years, Alestine Andre. And, having a partner like Alestine and others throughout the years really helped. We were working as a team, together, not as researchers, but with the elders, with youth, for the whole communities, to accomplish all these things that we did together. There's no one person that can do this kind of work. It really takes a good, dedicated team, I think. And have to recognize that some research is going to take a hell of a long time, from beginnings to the end. And I see I have 30 seconds left. Okay. The Placenames project we did took 23 years to complete, and it's still going on a little bit, but community and land-based history book for one of the communities took about 10 years. Replication of Canadian caribou skin clothing took about 3 years. It's just some examples. I think it's important to learn about protocols, in any area that you're going to be working in. And in the Gwich'in area, we helped develop a Gwich'in traditional knowledge policy that also included a research agreement framework. And that really helped with defining all the stages of research in the Gwich'in communities. Research being kind that the community is interested in. And you can certainly get your degree out of research, but it's important, as has been said before, that the community gets something out of the research that's being carried out. Use plain language when communicating, absolutely essential. Listen, really listening, and acknowledging people you've worked with, and providing opportunities for community members to be co-authors as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks everyone. Yeah, this is such a huge topic, but I'm really loving the conversation, and I just wanted to thank everybody for their insights so far. And I wanted to echo what a lot of you said. The research should be bringing tangible benefits to the community. That's huge, not just the academic who's, like Crystal was saying, gonna get their degree and have a huge career based on some stories that they were told. The idea of consent and refusal, that's really important. Listening, the fact that it's messy. I really liked what Carolina said about the point being the relationship, not just the project. And what Ingrid's saying about, it's going to take longer than you think, and to be patient. From my perspective, I also think that students should know, and I think they're often not taught, that their methods and skills and perspectives, no matter what cultural background they come from, are embedded within certain epistemologies. So that's to say that too often Western science is perceived by like the general settler public as not having a culture of its own and being objective and neutral, but that isn't the case. So it's important to remember what perspective you are showing up with. Some of the things have already been said, but to talk to the community throughout, it's important to do that from the very beginning, from the inception of a project all the way to the end, to authorship and beyond, right? And folks need to be, like Indigenous community members need to be adequately compensated if they're participating in your research. In the context where I work, it's really common to give quite hefty and this is well-deserved honorariums because, you know, we're being paid potentially or getting the funding as researchers, but it's important to also bring that capacity into the community. And then what other people said as well, to be prepared to make mistakes. It is something that's going to happen. It happens for all of us. And when you do make mistakes, instead of, you know, cowering away and hiding, the important thing is to kind of accept what happened humbly and see it as an opportunity to learn. So to really understand from the perspective of the community that you're working with or whoever what you did wrong, ask what you can do better to try to fix the situation or to do better in the future. And the point as well is to keep showing up, keep practicing, keep having these conversations and pushing for these kinds of relationships and having good intentions in your heart and thinking about how you can constantly enact kindness and respect and inclusivity in your work. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone. Yes, all really, really fantastic points. I really appreciate all the perspectives that have been shared already. Some of the ones that I was also going to highlight, so I won't spend a lot of time on them, but was just that aspect of humility and relationships and long-term commitment. Those were kind of things I had also been reflecting on in response to this question. Something I'd like to add is that I really encourage as graduate students, but for anyone, professors, consultants, government researchers, to really go in as a learner. I mean, it might seem obvious if you're a graduate student, but sometimes I think people get caught up in kind of pre-established goals and you might forget to listen or ask about community priorities. And those priorities can come up in all sorts of formal and informal conversations. So really just going as a learner, spending a lot more time listening than talking, and being flexible and adaptable. So I had also highlighted patience. That relates to flexibility, just, you know, basically being patient and open to research directions being refined or changed according to community priorities, and really needing to follow community timelines, like recognizing and understanding what's going on in the community. Like Carolina mentioned, you know, if it's an important season for walrus hunting or goose hunting or spring fishing, you know, we can't expect people to drop everything and participate in a project that's happening. So that's really, really important and something I've had to learn and adjust over time. I also really want to echo Crystal's comment about personal intentions, really reflecting on it ahead of time. Is it for personal gain to get a degree, or is it to make a broader contribution? And I have been directly asked those questions, meeting with hunters and trappers organizations in multiple communities as I was starting my PhD. I was there to ask if there was even any interest in working on a sea ice project together. And one of the first questions was always, you know, you're going to get a degree out of this. What are we going to get? And so that was, you know, from the beginning, something that really stuck with me and something I had to keep reflecting on and being able to work on articulating. And the other thing that always came up was, you know, how are we going to access the information? So reporting is so essential, but not just reporting, not just writing a report, but kind of a constant attention to how to share what is being done in different creative and accessible ways amongst different community partners. And so I guess the last thing to highlight there related to intentions is that community benefit. I'm just emphasizing what's already been said, but this comes up a lot too from the Akuma-Vik Society that we work with in Arviat. They're always highlighting how for the community to engage in any partnership, they need to see a direct benefit. So Thank you. So as students, planning your work, just really keep that in mind, and the patience and the flexibility and the humility and the sense of humor that goes along with learning together.
Amazing. Thank you all for those really thoughtful and honest answers. I really appreciate that. So gosh, this hour has just gone by so quickly, and we have a bunch of questions rolling in, which is really exciting. And I think the way we'll handle this, we have about 6 minutes left, which is, I acknowledge up front, not even remotely enough. So I think what we'll do is we'll continue on in the order that we've been doing, and I'll let you pick which of these questions that have come in on the right you would prefer to answer. And if you thought 3 minutes was bad, I'm about to give you a 1 minute time period to answer the question, with the caveat that if you do want to talk more about it or want to answer another question you haven't been able to get to, you can click that button that says type answer, and you can enter an answer there for folks to see. So I will continue timing you, and I'll give you a 30-second warning right before, 30 seconds into your answer, and hopefully that's enough to at least get something out that feels honest and useful to you. So Dr. Fraser, do you want to start us off?
Yes, okay, I'm going to switch gears into fast talking mode. I think that the first and the final questions I'm going to try and tackle. So Sydney asks, can you talk a little bit about research fatigue in communities and how we can try and minimize our contributions to it? For sure, 100%, not every community wants to be researched. A lot of Indigenous communities are struggling with food insecurity. They have poor, overcrowded homes. Like, the point being that a lot more, oh my gosh, a lot more things to deal with than worrying about, having to hold someone's hand as they go through a research project. So yeah, I don't feel like I answered that. It was more of an acknowledgement that if your emails aren't being answered, if you can't find anyone to talk to, then that might be an indication that they're busy with other things. Allison, communities do not necessarily have homogenous views. How can you deal with diverse views? And so 5 more seconds. I think the acknowledgement that there is no one pan-Indigenous identity, that even under the Indian Act, there are 634 First Nations, not even including Métis or Inuit communities. And so taking the responsibility to educate yourself on the uniqueness and diversity and beauty of each community. Thank you.
Koyana, I'm drawn to the exact same 2 questions, so I'll just try to build off of what Crystal was saying. I'll go for the first one. Yes, about communities. Every single Indigenous community is different. Every single one of them, even with shared language, you have different words in every one of them, and they should never be treated as the same. And part of equity is understanding and being guided by the community that you're working with. And recognizing for that, giving authority to that community to define for you who you should be working with, what guidelines do they have, what priorities do you have. As you know, I work for the Inuit Circumpolar Council. We have just within Alaska alone, 97 different communities. Yet we have projects that have a voice from all of them. So absolutely, it's more than possible to have a collective voice, but everybody has to be involved to see what that voice is. Research fatigue, very quickly. One way to address research fatigue, and I really agree with, invest in building your own capacity by ensuring that you educate yourself on the histories, governance, knowledge, all of these things for a community. Okay, and then for the research fatigue, in investing in your own capacity building, within that you should also be building your relationship with the community to better understand what are their research needs, what are the questions that they have asked. And oftentimes we find communities have fatigue because people are asking them the same questions over and over again and not getting any benefit from that. So that's actually something different than research fatigue. Okay.
If I could just go back to I know it's already been answered, the first one about research fatigue. And I think then, Caroline, you just mentioned towards your end what I was going to say, and that, I think, as students, trying to build relationships, I mean, to determine what's community actually interested in having research. And I know over the years, we had a list of different research projects that we're interested in pursuing. And so knowing that, I think, can help. Also having a central agency like the Gwich'in Social Culture Institute, that are morphed into a department of the Gwich'in Tribal Council. Having one entity sort of responsible for all heritage and traditional knowledge research in the Gwich'in area was really useful, because we could say, okay, well, that kind of research already has been done. We've got information already. You can build on it, sure, but there are other things that might be of interest. Thank you.
Dr. Joly, it's your turn to answer whichever question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I want to let somebody else speak. I was typing my answers out in the chat.
I'd be happy to try and build on the answers for that first question. I was also trying to type some answers, or not answers, but suggestions for the other ones. I think research fatigue is a huge concern, and just from my experience in Nunavut, it comes up a lot in community meetings. I would encourage you to take the time to look and read and talk and find out what has happened, what work has been done in a community before, as a starting point. And for Nunavut anyway, there's the Nunavut Research Institute has compendiums every year of licensed research that's available. So that's a really good place to go. And we're actually also working with them to try to make those summaries from licensed projects more available. Sometimes it's actually really hard to find out what has happened before until you get there and you learn from people. So we're hoping to make that licensing database more accessible to help address some of this challenge around research fatigue.
Great, thank you. Dr. Joly, do you want to jump in?
I just want to echo what everybody said. For me, yeah, research fatigue is also a big issue. Often it involves, communicating with leadership and making sure that, the individuals that we're asking to speak to us actually, want to do so, and trying not to repeat the same questions. I've been involved in a lot of traditional use studies where we often repeatedly ask questions like, where do you spend time on the land and what do you do there? And often, because communities have certain people who have expertise in a given area, it's often the same person being interviewed. So what we try to do is mix up the questions, ask different histories, and try to get, maybe more, ask more diverse questions. And then take advantage of the work that's already been done. I really liked what Gita said about that as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for all of your responses and for answering questions in a minute, which I know is an impossible task that I asked you to do. So thank you for bearing with. Dr. Fraser had to run out because she had another event right at noon Mountain Time, and we are a couple minutes over. So I'm going to wrap up the panel. Thank you all. We really appreciate everything you said. And this was a really, really great learning opportunity for all of us. So thank you. And yeah, we look forward to connecting with you in other ways. And feel free to stay on for any presentations that you'd like. The conference goes on for the rest of today and tomorrow. And we have our keynote speaker tomorrow and student presentations today and tomorrow as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.